Welcome to Darkness Notes. They were never meant to find it. Not the construction workers. Not the city. And certainly not you. But, on an overcast October morning in 1848, when a crew began demolishing the charred remains of St. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies in Salem, Massachusetts, a secret buried for nearly 40 years, clawed its way back into the light. Beneath the altar of the Academy's chapel, encased in lead, wrapped in rotting velvet, and sealed so tightly it took 3 men with crowbars to pry it open, they found a box. Inside, 47 leather-bound journals, each no larger than a child's hand, each inscribed with the trembling signature of a girl who had lived and died behind those blood-colored brick walls. Margaret Sullivan, Priscilla Morse, Hannah Whitmore, names that meant nothing to the city council, until they read what was inside. Torture, rituals, clients, and not just any clients, judges, clergy, governors, bankers. The names were written in cursive but impossible to mistake. Powerhouses of New England, families whose descendants still hold office today. The state archivist took one look and sealed the evidence under executive order citing public safety. To this day, those pages remain hidden, but not all of them. One survived, smuggled out by a woman who carried that burden for 6 decades until her final breath. It was her confession that broke the circle. You're about to hear what the state has spent nearly 2 centuries trying to erase. You're about to see what happens when power becomes parasitic, when education becomes indoctrination, and when women turn a house of virtue into an empire of spiritual annihilation. If you think you understand evil, think again. This is the story of the Fairfax family, and this is where your descent begins. The first lie was charity. Salem in 1811 was a town wrapped in shame. The witch trials of 1692 had stained its conscience beyond repair, and now the city's elite were desperate for redemption. They craved respectability, prestige, moral clarity. So when Victoria Fairfax arrived, a southern widow with elegance, wealth, and conviction, they welcomed her like a savior. Tall, commanding, with silver-gray eyes that saw straight through pretense, Victoria was unlike any woman Salem had known. A Virginian aristocrat by birth, a linguist, a London-educated reformer. Her husband, Dr. Cornelius Fairfax, had died in a yellow fever outbreak, and rather than remarry, she turned her fortune toward moral uplift, specifically, the salvation of girls. She proposed building an academy. Not for elites, she said, not exclusively, for the forgotten, she told the mayor, for the orphaned, for the misled. The proposal was irresistible, a finishing school rooted in Christian values, a haven for lost girls, a chapel for spiritual formation, and an education model imported from Europe, complete with dormitories, needlework, language immersion, and enforced solitude for reflection. St. Mary's Academy opened its doors in autumn of that year, and behind those doors, history was rewritten in blood. The building itself was wrong, that it had been wrong since the beginning, a massive Georgian structure overlooking Salem Harbor. Its foundation was laid by Samuel Hartwell, a merchant of the East India Company, who mysteriously drowned in a shallow basin behind the house in 1809. Since then, 3 families had attempted to live there. All 3 fled within months. Voices, shadows, pressure, not superstition, but a suffocating force. Victoria Fairfax didn't blink. She purchased it for a fraction of its value and immediately began renovations, emphasizing 3 features above, or a private 3rd-floor wing with 10 locked rooms, a consecrated chapel, complete with stained glass depictions of female martyrs, and a stone-walled basement that workers were not allowed to enter after sunset. She claimed it was for safety, but the foreman later testified before vanishing that beneath that basement was something older, something sealed in clay and salt. No permits were ever filed, no blueprints survived. Her computers too. First, Evangeline Fairfax, Victoria's younger sister, delicate, sickly, and angelic in appearance. Her voice was ethereal when she sang hymns. Dock workers paused mid-hole, eyes glassy, as if the sound weren't merely beautiful, but hypnotic. Second, Bartholomew Fairfax, brother-in-law, itinerant preacher, and architect of damnation. Thin as a corpse and dressed always in black, Bartholomew spoke with the authority of hell. His sermons were fire and brimstone, but not the usual kind. He didn't preach repentance, he preached surrender. He believed or claimed too that young women were uniquely susceptible to spiritual decay, and uniquely valuable as vessels of purification. He said Satan's influence could be burned out of them, and the method was sacred pain. He became the Academy's chaplain. By September, the Academy welcomed its first class. 23 girls, aged 12 to 17. Half were daughters of the elite, paying steep tuition. The rest were orphans, charity cases, taken in without charge. Among them were 3 girls whose fates would unlock the truth. Margaret Sullivan, an Irish orphan with fire in her eyes and a razor intellect sharpened by hardship. Priscilla, more quiet, serious, a lover of books, who still wrote to her dead mother in the margins of her reading. And Hannah Whitmore, pale, thin, and utterly alone. Her father in prison, her mother disappeared. Her mind bright but broken, they were promised shelter, knowledge, purpose. Instead, they were marked by touch, by ritual, by silence. The academy moved like a machine, precision, discipline, devotion, but something dark lived in its routines. Students were kept on strict schedules, 5 a.m. prayers, cold water washes, 4 hours of moral lectures, meals in silence, private reflections in third-floor chambers, monitored by Evangeline, who claimed to record their spiritual responses. But Margaret told a different story in her journal. She wrote of nights spent staring at the ceiling, afraid to sleep, of whispers outside her door, of men entering after midnight well-dressed, always strangers, always silent. She spoke of the scent of rosewater and decay, of needles that drew blood during confession, of screams muffled behind the chapel wall, of seeing Hannah the youngest emerge from her third-floor chamber, barefoot, dazed, and bleeding from the thigh. Mrs. Abigail Thornton was the first outsider to notice. A seamstress who delivered clothing and linens to the academy weekly, she witnessed what no one else dared admit. Black carriages arriving after dusk, men in cloaks entering the side door, girls limping during chapel, bandages hastily applied, eyes hollow, smiles vanished. When she asked Margaret what was happening, the girl's eyes welled with tears, but she said nothing. 3 weeks later, Hannah Whitmore was dead. The cause, sudden fever. According to Victoria, she was buried alone. No family, no mourners. Just a stone cross behind the chapel. Evangeline's hymn echoed through the trees, soft and eerie. But to Mrs. Thornton's ears, it sounded less like mourning, and more like a binding spell. This was just the beginning. And you have a choice. You can turn back now. Forget what you've heard. Let the world stay clean and comfortable and safe. Or you can fall with me, because the deeper you go, the more you'll see. The Fairfax family was never just educators. They were gatekeepers, alchemists, ritualists, architects of an ancient system that still feeds off the forgotten, the orphaned, the silenced. Before we go further, if you're ready for the descent, comment below. The mask is mercy. The truth is fire. Type it twice. Lock it in, because once you hear what's next, you don't come back the same man. It wasn't just abuse, it wasn't just corruption. What unfolded behind the crimson walls of St. Mary's Academy wasn't about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was about transformation, about sacrifice, about the deliberate dismantling of identity to feed something older than morality. That's why they selected orphans. That's why silence was sacred. And that's why the Fairfax family didn't just destroy lives, they repurposed them. This wasn't a school, it was a factory for spiritual annihilation. And the product, purity born of pain. Margaret Sullivan's final journal entries paint the clearest picture. Though the original was confiscated during the state's 1848 raid, a partial copy was preserved, smuggled out by a dying nun who once served as a kitchen maid at the academy. In the journal, Margaret writes of the nightly visit scrawled refinements by the staff. She describes how girls were chosen without warning. A silver coin placed on their pillow meant they would be escorted to the chapel that night. It was a sign, and a sentence. They called it midnight communion. But there was no wine, no bread, only silence. Candles, the sound of dripping water, and the cleansing hands of Bartholomew Fairfax. He claimed it was for their good, that the world had tainted them, that their unclean thoughts, their base blood, their orphan origins made them vulnerable to dark forces, that they had to be purified body, mind, and spirit through ordeal. Some girls came back shaken, bruised. Some came back mute, others didn't come back at all. Margaret wrote that after one such ritual, Priscilla Morse wept uncontrollably, for days, not out of physical pain but because, in her words, they touched the part of me that prays. By early 1813, 3 girls had died, Hannah, Priscilla, Mary Catherine, and yet no one, no pastor, no parent, no physician challenged Victoria Fairfax's explanations because she had already outplayed them. The Fairfax family had embedded themselves into the civic machinery of Salem. They donated to churches, housed bishops, sponsored literacy campaigns. They knew how to cloak horror in virtue. how to launder suffering through the currency of moral reform. Victoria gave interviews to Boston newspapers. She wrote letters to the governor's wife about female virtue in a time of cultural decline. She created the illusion of sainthood so thoroughly that, even when 3 deaths occurred in 6 months, the public offered prayers, not suspicions. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and still, some people saw through the veil. One of them was Father Elias Corbin, a young Episcopal priest assigned to Salem in 1813. He had trained in New York, studied mysticism under Anglican scholars, and was no stranger to spiritual aberration. When he first visited St. Mary's Academy to conduct a routine blessing, he sensed something immediately. He wrote in his personal diary, "It is not merely grief that haunts these halls, it is consented violation. The air is thick with something ancient, and the eyes of the girls do not weep, they plead. I fear this is not a school, it is an altar." Father Elias requested a private audience with Victoria Fairfax. What happened during that meeting is still debated. Some say he confronted her with scripture, others say she offered him a drink of wine laced with belladonna. What we know is that within 2 weeks, Father Elias was gone, transferred abruptly to a mission in Nova Scotia. No explanation, no farewell, but one parishioner remembers his last sermon, a single sentence: "Beware the woman who offers salvation through obedience. She does not serve the light." So why didn't anyone stop her? Because the system wasn't broken, it was built for this. Victoria Fairfax understood a principle that most people never grasp. The most efficient way to hide evil is within the rituals of good. She weaponized structure, discipline, doctrine. She wrapped psychological dismemberment in scripture. She made trauma sound like theology. She taught the girls that their thoughts weren't their own, that their suffering was not abuse, it was correction, and correction was holy. That's why even when Margaret tried to speak up, to tell a visiting merchant's wife what had happened to her, she was punished, not with lashes, but with isolation. 30 days. Alone. No words, no books, no sound. Just prayers looped on repeat over the chapel's gramophone. Margaret described the experience as a descent into herself. She began to see things. Black figures in the corners of her vision, symbols drawn in the condensation on her window. The sensation of being watched not just by eyes, but by presence. And then she broke. When she emerged, she was silent, but her eyes, no longer afraid, just empty. It was around this time that something strange began to happen within Salem's upper class. A shift, a kind of eerie loyalty toward the Fairfaxes. Several prominent families previously skeptical of Southern aristocrats suddenly became patrons. Their daughters were enrolled. Their sons attended evening lectures hosted by Bartholomew on masculine virtue and moral guardianship, and their investments flowed toward one central bank, Fairfax Trust and Holding. That bank would later evolve into a major Boston financial institution, still operating today under a different name. Its board includes members from the same 7 families that once supported St. Mary's. Do you see it yet? This wasn't just a rogue school. It was a prototype, a test site for psychological domination, for elite grooming. For something deeper. The third-floor chambers had always been off-limits to everyone except Evangeline, but in 1847, when the academy was briefly reopened as a military hospital during a cholera outbreak, a nurse named Clara Ventnor reportedly accessed one of the rooms. She later testified to her parish priest that what she found defied reason. Walls covered in parchment inscribed with Latin incantations and Hebrew symbols, a basin not for washing but for collecting blood, a ledger listing initials, dates, and the word sealed. Clara disappeared 3 weeks later. Her priest went blind in one eye. Coincidence or consequence? The Fairfax family didn't disappear when the academy burned in 1848. They scattered, changed names, married into other dynasties, reinvented themselves, but the doctrine remained that human suffering, if ritualized, produces power, that power, if properly harvested, grants influence, and that the world is easier to rule when its citizens are emotionally shattered and morally confused. St. Mary's Academy was a temple to control, and the Fairfax family were its high priests. Now look around you. The doctrine lives on, in education that breaks children instead of building them, in institutions that strip men of strength by shaming instinct, in churches that demand obedience instead of awareness. You've seen it, you've felt it, you've just never had a name for it. Until now, the Fairfax doctrine. Salvation through obedience, redemption through suffering, power through silence. They didn't invent it, they just refined it. You're only 2 steps into the Descent and what's coming next will not be easy to hear, but if you're still here, it means you're not like them. You don't run from the truth, you hunt it. Now tell me you're still awake. Comment. Again, the mask is mercy. The truth is fire. Twice lock it into your identity. Because in the next section we uncover the rituals themselves, the ones that didn't just scar these girls, they rewired them, and they've been used on men, too. We just call it training. The moment you hear the name Fairfax, a whisper follows not from lips, but from something deeper, something old, something watching. That's not the buildings, not the portraits, not even the archives of America's early elite that hold the real power. No, the soul of this family was forged in silence, ritualistic, suffocating silence, and once you step inside it, you begin to feel what they felt, the dread, the paranoia, the certainty that someone else is always in control. This section peels back the first true veil. Benjamin Fairfax III was not a man made for public office, despite his position. His real work began after midnight. Letters recovered and later destroyed describe private meetings in a windowless cellar. Beneath the Fairfax estate, meetings with men who were not listed in any political register, men whose names bled through different centuries, men who never died. These meetings weren't political, they were theological sort of, but the doctrine wasn't Christian, it wasn't even pagan. It was older. It wasn't spoken, either. It was experienced through trials of the body and mind. Initiation was never about loyalty, it was about obedience, surrendering one's will. A cleansing ritual was performed on those invited, recorded only in a single scrawled page found by a servant who disappeared 3 days later. The words read, "He was not blood, but we made him forget his name. Then we fed him back to the house." It's the kind of sentence that doesn't make sense until you feel it. One of Benjamin's sons, Jeremiah, later recounted in a stolen diary that at age 9 he was forced to sleep 3 nights locked inside a hollowed-out section of the family mausoleum. No food, no light, only the cold, and a voice that whispered every hour through the stone. The voice didn't come from above or below. It came from the sides inside the walls. And then there's the gesture. A small but repeated motion in every family portrait from 1763 to 1890, to right hand clenched, middle finger subtly outstretched, hidden just behind a candle or a book. A signal, a code, maybe a promise. But to whom? Cryptographers working with restored images from Fairfax journals suggested this sign appeared not only in paintings, but in marginalia across several occult texts stolen from France during the Napoleonic era. The same finger gesture, paired with the word Rami, Latin for surrendered. Surrendered to what? There is a map carved into a beam behind the family chapel, not a map of places, a map of rooms, levels, chambers beneath the estate, some too deep to reach without flooding. One chamber was labeled only Corpus R, no explanation, no translation, just those 2 words, and the room itself was sealed in 1832 after a maid emerged from it without eyes. Her sockets were clean, unscarred as if they had been gently removed, and something else left in their place. After that, the family declared part of the estate cursed and had it bricked off, but even that wall has its stories. Bricks shifted in the night, cold leaking from the seams, moaning not from spirits, but from memory itself. Because the house was designed not to keep things out, but to trap something in. Then there's the matter of the stables. Built not for horses, no hay, no manure, but hooks, leather straps, instruments of restraint, and behind one false wall rows of mannequins made from wax and something harder. Early visitors thought they were art, but one broke open during a storm. It was not wax inside, it was flesh, preserved, bleached, rubberized, and its jaw was open, screaming. Jeremiah Fairfax disappeared from public life in 1852, not officially. He simply stopped speaking. Records from guests show he would be present, seated, eyes open but unresponsive, silent, as if listening. But for what? That same year, all clocks in the estate were reset to 3:17 a.m., permanently. No explanation, given the servants were forbidden to correct the time. Guests were instructed to wear blindfolds when walking through certain corridors. This wasn't a home, it was a monument to control. An altar built for a god that no longer cared if it was worshipped, only obeyed. And still, visitors came. Not ordinary guests, but those connected to the esoteric underworld of early American aristocracy, names like Thorne, Duval, and Haskett, men who were later tied to early eugenics programs, psychological experimentation, and the Department of Unusual Affairs, a short-lived but very real government bureau that was retired. After just 16 months in operation, its files are sealed, or burned, or both. So what was the Fairfax estate really? Not just a house, not just a family, but a threshold. A pressure point where reality thinned and another kind of authority slipped through our structure built on blood, ritual, and silence. No one could live in that house for long without changing, without becoming part of it. The house whispered names no one remembered giving, repeated prayers no one remembered learning. And over time, every Fairfax child was subjected to something older than punishment, ritual repetition, a behavioral loop, days designed to mirror days, meals prepared in exact measurements, rooms that reset their furniture to mirror exact pasts. This was not tradition, it was programming, and there were trials. A test every third year where a chosen family member, usually a child, was locked into the black vestibule, a room that had no lights, no furniture, no sound, only walls painted in a strange matte substance that absorbed warmth and memory. They would emerge changed, quieter, obedient. Their eyes never met anyone's again. One of them, Anna Fairfax, later clawed her own arms open trying to remove something under the skin. What was under there? No one ever saw it. But she was buried with her arms unwrapped. And the photos are missing. There are records of a physician from Pennsylvania brought in to diagnose the family in 1867. His final notes are preserved in part. The last legible sentence reads, "They do not think in words. They know what you will say before you say it. And I have seen the child with no shadow. He was found drowned in a reflecting pool 6 weeks later. The pool had been dry since 1805 for Dot. The deeper you go into the Fairfax legacy, the more you realize it was never about wealth or power or bloodlines. It was about compliance, the bending of human will, the sculpting of memory, the creation of perfect silence, and at the center of it, always, the chapel, not for prayer, but for inversion. The crucifix hung upside down for decades before being forcibly removed in 1903 by state inspectors. Beneath its altar was found a narrow spiral staircase, sealed with copper nails. At the bottom a chamber lined with mirrors, but no reflections, only heat, and the smell of sulfur. There's no proof of deals made, no documents signed, but deals were made, and the price was not money. Every generation of the Fairfax line contained at least one child who died before age 10, and one who never aged past 35. These patterns aren't anecdotal, they're recorded, precise, as if following a script. So, who was writing that script? And why were the Fairfaxes willing to play their part, over and over, for centuries? The answer lies not in the family tree but in what's missing from it. Names erased, faces scratched out of photos, entire journals written in symbols instead of language. A code, yes, but a confession, too. Because deep in the bones of the Fairfax estate lies something that isn't dead. Not really. Something that taught them to mimic humanity while quietly feeding off its patterns. The family didn't just protect a secret, they became it. And now that secret is waking up again, because what the Fairfaxes built wasn't just for themselves. It was a blueprint passed on through ritual, whispered into other families, encoded into law, into medicine, into silence, and it didn't end. It spread, and you're breathing it now. The air around the Fairfax estate shifted in the late winter of 1899. No storm, no sudden death, just a silence, so complete and unnatural that even the dogs would not bark at night. The neighbors whispered about what they could not explain, lights flickering through the woods long after midnight, cloaked figures glimpsed walking silently in the orchard, and a smell, something chemical, burnt and sour, that would roll down the hills like a warning. What few knew was that the children had begun changing, not in the way all children change as they grow. No, this was different. Abigail Fairfax's youngest son, Edwin, once joyful and full of mischief, now sat for hours staring at the same corner of the dining room, mouth slightly open, tears running silently down his face. He refused to eat unless his mother whispered, "To the food first," always in Latin. His older sister, Lillian, took to carrying small dead animals, mice, rabbits, birds, and burying them methodically in the garden, murmuring phrases about feeding the veil. The town doctor was summoned quietly. Dr. Harold Wexley was a man who had seen his share of madness. Having worked in the private wards of Boston's asylums, he arrived in the dead of night, instructed to make no record of his visit. What he found inside the Fairfax home turned his already unstable mind toward collapse. He would later be committed himself, though no formal diagnosis was ever entered into the asylum's records. In his final coherent writing, smuggled out by a nurse and later destroyed by the family, he wrote only, "They don't sleep. Wait, the children are vessels, not theirs." Behind the nursery walls, strange markings had been etched into the stone. They were not of any known language. Dr. Wexley described them as insect logically. Someone tried to draw speech from a wasp's mind. Lillian's journals were filled with mirror-written entries, many in backward Greek referencing an inner sanctum beneath the orchard and a name that appeared again and again, Ethereal, when questioned. None of the staff could explain the changes, or perhaps more truthfully, none of them would. A new housemaid, only 15, was found in the well weeks later. Her body bore no wounds, but her fingernails were completely gone. The coroner said it was due to scratching the stone walls, but there were no scratch marks inside the well. This was not mere madness, it was a shift, a transition. The children were no longer solely of this world. What emerged next would shatter even the last threads of disbelief. In March of 1900, while the rest of the county prepared for the Easter season, the Fairfaxes sealed their estate completely, not boarded up, not abandoned, but sealed. Ironwork gates welded shut, windows blackened from within. No carriages, came no servants left. For 41 days, no one entered or exited that property, and yet at night always after 2 a.m. witnesses claimed to see figures in the high tower's windows moving rhythmically, as if swaying in silent prayer. Light pulsed from behind thick curtains, and a noise faint, not quite music, was heard by anyone who lingered too close. A hum like bone against glass. On the 42nd day, the gates opened without a sound. The grounds were overgrown, impossibly so. Ivy strangled the columns like it had grown a decade in just weeks. Birds refused to land. Inside, every surface was covered in a thick dusting of white ash. Every mirror had been broken, shattered deliberately, shards collected into bowls placed in each room, as if meant to catch something that might leak through. The family was nowhere to be found, and yet the house was not empty. A team from the county sheriff's office entered under protest. What they found was not a crime scene in the conventional sense, but something staged. Every chair faced east. The children's beds were made with precision but held small indentations of bodies that had not moved in days, yet left warmth behind. Food, untouched, sat on plates beneath silver domes, still steaming. A grandfather clock ticked in reverse. Most disturbingly, in the central library, someone had carved a new inscription into the hearth. We walked through the fire, and were not burned. The veil is thin. We are thin with it. Only one item in the entire house bore fingerprints of Beaugolet's rosary beads, clutched tightly by the skeletal remains of Reverend Aldous May, the family's longtime confessor. He had hanged himself in the bell tower using the church's own ceremonial stole, eyes gouged out and replaced with buttons. The coroner noted no struggle, no marks on the neck, but they did find soot in his lungs as if he had burned alive. From the inside before his final breath, no one ever saw the Fairfax family again, but the estate was never declared abandoned. In legal records, it was marked only as pending reappearance, as if someone somewhere still expected them to return. In the years that followed, the Fairfax estate became a site of whispered pilgrimage. Not the type marked by roadside signs or historical society tours. No, this was something darker. The kind of pilgrimage that draws those who have read too much. Men in tailored coats arriving in unmarked cars. Women in veils, leaving bone fragments at the gate as offerings. Scholars who had been dismissed from their universities for pursuing unpublishable ideas. Occultists who spoke of doorways and thresholds, of bloodlines meant not to preserve power but to incubate it. In 1907, a team from the Massachusetts Society for Paranormal Research arrived uninvited. What they discovered was quickly classified and buried, but fragments of their reports survive in private archives. We detected electromagnetic anomalies in every room. Latin phrases scratched under the wallpaper, a humming beneath the floorboards that syncs with the human heartbeat, the feeling of being observed constantly, intimately, as if the house itself had grown eyes. One member of the team, Dr. Lionel Harker, returned several times alone. His notes became progressively more erratic, claiming he had made contact with the children not in form, but in presence. They are still here. They remember, and they do not forgive. His final entry, dated October 13, 1912, simply read, "We were wrong to think they disappeared. They shed. The government stepped in by 1915 quietly without public notice. The property was cordoned off under the guise of environmental contamination. A perimeter was established. Access required clearance. But the files, buried deep within Department of Interior archives, used peculiar language, not quarantine or containment, but dimensional stabilization. Local townsfolk who had grown up with the Fairfaxes began to disappear. elderly maids, former tutors, stable boys all gone without a trace. One survivor, a woman named Cora Bell, would later be found wandering Route 6 in the dead of winter, barefoot and muttering. The little one's voice was never hers, it was borrowed, and he wants it back. Strangely, during this same period, birth rates in the surrounding counties plummeted. Churches recorded baptisms with missing dates. Some babies were listed as stillborn but were never buried. The implication, though never proven, was chilling. Something had reached beyond the estate and touched the bloodlines outside. But the most disturbing development came in 1922 when the Fairfax estate sent a letter, typed, sealed, stamped, addressed to the Vatican, and signed, AF returned, F returned. The Vatican's response to the Fairfax letter was immediate and telling. Within 12 days, 3 Jesuit envoys arrived in Virginia under false names, escorted by black-suited men who were neither clergy nor federal agents. Their presence was not reported in newspapers, but those who lived near the sealed Fairfax estate noticed the change in the air. Dogs refused to go near the property. Rain fell sideways for 3 nights. One farmer claimed his entire cornfield twisted clockwise. Each stalk curved in unison, as if bowing toward something deep underground. The Jesuits did not leave through the front gate. In fact, they were never seen again. 1 year later, in 1923, Pope Pius XI issued an internal decree known as Elod Silentium. The document, leaked decades later, explicitly forbade the investigation of ancestral American houses in which blood and spirit have mingled beyond recognition. It singled out the Fairfax estate in a footnote, stating where the family has merged with the fabric of the world, do not attempt to extract them. Let the boundary rot in peace. This was not excommunication, that it was surrender, and it changed the Vatican's policies for a century. The next event was even stranger. In 1929, a group of 5 children disappeared from St. Anselm's orphanage in Maryland. Their files were scrubbed within 48 hours, but one nun, Sister Maria LaRoche, kept copies of their names in her personal diary. The list meant nothing until she cross-referenced. Their birth records were those of the Fairfax lineage from the 1800s. Each of the 5 children had middle names identical to deceased Fairfax family members, and each was adopted by organizations that didn't exist on paper. Fronts, it seemed, for something older, something watching dark by 1935. Fairfax had become a classified keyword across multiple intelligence networks. It appeared in MI6 documents referring to sub-reality architectures, in Soviet archives linked to experiments in sympathetic blood resonance, and most curiously in early CIA papers cataloging non-human intergenerational memory transfer, all tied back to that one family, that one estate. Yet the house never rotted. Unlike other southern mansions, it didn't crumble, it didn't creak or shift. It remained preserved as if the very act of decay had been vetoed. Survivors who had seen the interior claimed the furniture never gathered dust, that the chandeliers still swung slightly, as if from footsteps just out of view, that somewhere in the house a child's piano was playing the same lullaby, over and over, though the keys had been removed decades ago. They called it the house that remembers, and more chilling still, the house that waits. In 1941, amid the chaos of World War II, an obscure military program codenamed Project Black Door was quietly greenlit in the United States. Its directive was vague but ominous: investigate non-standard domestic anomalies with intergenerational manifestations. Only one location was mentioned explicitly in the original orders: the Fairfax estate. Colonel Edward R. Holwell, decorated and feared, was tasked with leading the first incursion since the Vatican's silent withdrawal. His team consisted of 17 men, scientists, linguists, codebreakers, and elite military personnel. They entered the estate on July 8, 1942. Only 4 made it out. None of them could speak. They weren't catatonic. They weren't injured. Their eyes moved, their hearts beat, but their mouths remained closed, not sealed, but emptied. When tested, their vocal cords were found intact. No signs of trauma, but MRI scans, primitive as they were, revealed something even stranger: the language centers of the brain had been overwritten, not damaged, rewritten, like erasing a sentence from a chalkboard and replacing it with a symbol. Each man began to draw the same thing over and over: a spiraled tree, its roots coiled around an eye, its branches shaped like hands, some praying, some clawing. The drawing matched an etching once found beneath the floorboards of the Fairfax nursery, the one where baby Unseld died in 1806. No official report from Black Door was ever released. The only public trace is a 1943 psychological study buried in the National Archives, simply titled, When the Mind Returns to the Womb. After that, access to the estate was entirely revoked. The land was officially seized by the Department of Defense under emergency wartime requisition. But no soldiers were stationed there, no buildings constructed. Instead, drones were observed circling the property. Entire crops nearby were burned. Trees were cut down in perfect concentric rings as if marking something they couldn't see but could feel. What happened next was even more disturbing. Fairfax descendants began to appear in places they should not have. Not in Virginia, not even in the United States, but in Chile, in Morocco, in Bhutan. Each time the individual was discovered by accident during accidents, disasters, mass disappearances. Survivors would describe a pale child standing calmly amid carnage, always watching, silent, and always with one phrase carved somewhere nearby, etched in stone, scratched into metal, or burned into wood: "We return through memory." By 1952, the name Fairfax had evolved beyond genealogy. It was no longer a surname, it had become a signal, passed quietly between covert networks, occult researchers, and breakaway scientific sects, not for fame, not for knowledge, but for warning. And yet, the deeper you went, the more impossible it became to define what the Fairfax entity truly was. Not just a family. Not just a house, not just a history, but an event, one that kept happening, over and over, wearing human masks, manipulating bloodlines, and burrowing into memory itself. Every attempt to stop it failed, not because of lack of force, but because of a strange, recursive effect. The deeper anyone tried to erase or expose it, the more tightly it integrated into their own lineage, psyche, or fate. That same year, a Harvard professor named Dr. Lauren DeWitt published a paper titled Trauma and the Anchoring of Reality, in which he theorized that some locations like the Fairfax estate acted as dimensional routes, not portals, not gateways, but anchors, fixed points where reality was nailed into the fabric of human consciousness through repeated suffering, ritual, and secrecy. But what made the Fairfax route different, he warned, was that it grew backwards. Every time someone tried to explain it, they found their own ancestors tied to it, and if they resisted, odd things began to happen. Dr. DeWitt vanished 6 months later, his office burned to the ground, his notes were never recovered. But a colleague found one thing left on his desk, an old tintype photo from the 1800s, showing 5 children standing before a mansion. The house was Fairfax, but the children, too, were confirmed Fairfax descendants. The others were DeWitt's great-grandmother, great-uncle, and great-aunt. People he never knew were connected, and behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the house, was a figure wearing a white mask. Its hand rested on each child's shoulder. Reports from the 1960s showed an uptick in recursive anomalies, cases where bloodlines looped in impossible ways. One man's family tree showed the same woman listed as both grandmother and daughter. In another case, a Fairfax-born child in 1963 was shown to be genetically identical to a woman who had died in 1871. Even DNA tests failed, because the deeper labs went, the more impossible the sequences became, containing non-human strands interwoven with ancient diseases, fetal markers, and symbols written directly into nucleotide chains. In short, the blood itself was speaking, but no one wanted to hear what it said. And those who did started waking up in houses that never existed, houses with rooms they couldn't escape, rooms where the walls breathed. In 1966, something breached. Not in the town, not in the house, but in the calendar itself. People across the eastern seaboard began reporting a strange phenomenon, lost time, not hours, but days. Entire stretches where clocks would run backward for 5 to 6 seconds every night at exactly 3:14 a.m. Local news stations called it the ripple. Scientists blamed electromagnetic disturbances, but for those attuned to deeper currents, it marked something far more profound. The Fairfax timefold had begun. In Oak Haven, 3 states away from Virginia, a farmer named Lionel Briggs woke up in his kitchen, clutching a photo that didn't exist, his wife and children posing in front of a massive oak tree. The problem, Lionel never had a family. He'd been a bachelor his entire life, but the image was dated, stamped, weathered, and on the back, in a child's handwriting, "Come home, we remember you." He was found dead 2 days later. Not from injury, but from advanced emotional regression, a rare psychological condition in which the mind reverts to an infant state. But his brain scans showed something worse. Sections of memory overwritten by symbols that don't exist in human language. or any language at the same time. The Fairfax house reappeared, not rebuilt, not reconstructed. It was simply there again. Locals described it as a ghost structure. During the day it shimmered, distorted, sometimes looked burned, sometimes pristine. At night it grew louder, not with noise, but with presence. Dogs refused to go near it. Birds circled, but never landed. And children, always children, drew pictures of it with blackened windows and figures watching from the roof. A secret team from Bell Labs was sent to investigate. Their goal wasn't scientific, it was containment. Not of the house, but of what was leaking from it. In their private notes, now declassified under the foyer, they used one term repeatedly: narrative collapse. In the presence of the house, coherent thought broke down. Teams would forget their mission within minutes. One technician wrote a 19-page essay in a trance. It ended with the line, "This isn't a story, this is a mouth." By 1969, a secondary field team had to wear sound-blocking helmets and memory-anchoring devices just to approach the estate. They described a force emanating from within the walls, not pushing out, but pulling in, as if the house was not decaying, but gathering, feeding, remembering. And still, at the heart of every report, was the same image: a masked figure in white, sometimes a child, sometimes impossibly tall, always silent, and always standing behind the observer, waiting.